All right, today I spoke with Ben. Let's get a quick introduction from him and then we'll jump into the full conversation.
Hi, I'm Ben Byford. I run a podcast called the Machine Ethics Podcast, and I also consult with companies, organizations on AI ethics and designing and building and implementing and knowing more about this area. And I also teach coding and design, and I also make computer games. So, completely all over the place. That's what I do.
So, before we get into it, I want to let you know what we are doing here at this series, Are You a Robot? In case this is your first time, we are trying to tackle some of the biggest and most complicated or oftentimes challenging questions that come up, and they are stemming from AI and related technologies. The way that we're doing that is we are gathering the best and brightest minds in their respective fields to come on and talk to me about how exactly they see the state of the world with respect to what they're working on and the greater AI ethics picture, AI governance. And we're not finishing the conversation here. I want to make that very clear that if you would like, we have a Slack channel where you can go and you can continue talking about any of the episodes that you see on here. There's some incredible conversations happening there. Right now, I encourage you to jump in it, get involved, introduce yourself, let us know what you're working on. And if you see the world any differently than we do, we encourage differences in opinions because that is how we will grow. We would love to try and come up with some best practices together as we move forward through this incredible space. Now, the last thing I will mention before we jump into the full conversation is that we have a sponsor. If you've been listening for a while, you know that EthicsGrade has sponsored us from the get-go, and they are doing some wonderful stuff when it comes to benchmarking or rating companies. Now, a little bit of background information about EthicsGrade. They are an ESG benchmarking or ratings company, I should say. So everyone knows that ESG studies the non-financial impacts that companies have on the environment. And what EthicsGrade is doing is they're niching down even more and they're studying the AI programs that different companies have. So that means that companies like Twitter or TikTok can be rated, or I should say, are rated on the EthicsGrade website, and you can see what kind of grade they got considering their AI ethics program. So I would implore you, go check out their website, ethicsgrade.io, have a play around, see all of these different ratings. And you might be surprised. Some of the companies that you think have got some incredible AI ethics programs might shock you in what they actually have. And other companies that you are for sure thinking haven't done anything on the AI ethics front also might shock you. I know it did for me. And so I highly encourage you to check that out. That is all for the intro. Let's get into it with Ben Byford.
Are you a robot?
Ben, it is great to have you here. Thank you for coming on this show, Are You a Robot? I think it is nice to have a fellow podcaster on here, not only for the audio quality, but also for the fact that you know how this all works and you've been doing it for quite some time. So I really want to dig in to what has been going on over the years as you've been doing your podcast on AI ethics. But before we get into that, I thought it might be a nice way to start the show by turning around the question that you like to ask people. As I've been a bit of an avid listener of your show as of late, what is AI, Ben?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And obviously, it's part of this whole area is that people have these kind of ideas in their brain about this language, right? It's all the semantics. And part of that comes from culture and the things that we see on TV and film and books, etc. And storytelling, and some of that comes from, some scientific research or more factual things over this side. And I think for me, AI is this amorphous thing, but you can kind of almost can't like put it into two boxes. You can say it's this thing over here, which is like this dream or this kind of endeavor for making a kind of artifice, which is human like or extra human like. So that's where we get into the kind of AGIs and superintelligence sort of style kind of viewpoints.
Yeah.
How do you make something which is more intelligent or as intelligent as we are? And again, we have to just start to sort of defining things like intelligence, etc. And then over here, you kind of have like what we have today, and is more kind of like what sometimes is called like fancy statistics, where you like as soon as something becomes understandable or dull, it ceases to become AI. And people often say that on the podcast, that it's often kind of like, AI is like all sorts of things until it's every day, and then it's not AI anymore, because we kind of use it and understand it a bit better. So I think it's both this kind of like technical thing that we're doing right now, and also this kind of endeavor at the same time.
That's so nice to hear. And it is funny. I know that there's a lot of people that have misconceptions or expect a lot more from AI.
Yeah.
And it's nice to hear you say, like, yeah, if we understand it, it's not exactly AI anymore. Along those lines, this was one that I was going to ask you later on, but I think I should probably ask it now that you said that. Where have you felt like AI had a lot of potential but has fallen flat? Like, where did you see something that was going to be used by AI or can still be used by AI, but so far there hasn't been anything to write home about?
Yeah, that is something that I don't normally talk about or think about. So it's a good question, I guess, to force me to do so. Yeah, the thing that I always say that AI is good at that humans are not very good at is an obvious thing, right? It's kind of like efficiency and speed. So you can give a system, millions of images, and they will look at it in a day and give you like a reasonably intelligible answer. Whereas you do that with a human being, even distributed human beings, and that's going to take forever, right? That's just not going to be a very useful situation. So the flip of the coin of what it is good for is those sorts of tasks, right? So looking at I don't know, cancer images or images of spotting something in an image over and over and over again. And it's quite good at that. It's things that humans are just unable to do. Like we are physically not able to do these sorts of applications. For some reason, quadcopters came into my head. So as soon as, again, comes under something which probably was AI and isn't AI anymore. Could you remember when quadcopters came in and they were like, what is that? That's amazing. It's like hovering around, self-righting itself.
Yeah, for those who don't know, can you explain what quadcopters are?
So they're kind of like little helicopters. And the idea was that you'd have these self-righting helicopters, and they could be very, very small, and they could behave correctly in different environments. So if you pushed it or there was lots of air pressure, it would still, regain its kind of like level, which means it could be used in all sorts of different environments. And when these things started self-piloting themselves as well as self-writing themselves, the applications made were becoming apparent, right? And this is, I don't know, 10 years ago. This is not actually that much time ago. And the maths, the algorithms putting together to do the self-writing bit and actually make them fly and coordinate the different, physical fans, right? The physical propellers and stuff. was a thing that had to be made. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's AI anymore, in that way. But essentially, it is taking this input and it's self-correcting, and it's doing a lot of that kind of normalization stuff, fancy statistics stuff inside. Probably going off on a tangent a little bit.
I love it. That's what this is all about, man. Just go off on as many tangents and as far into left field as you want.
Exactly. So I think that's one of those applications where from that point, I could imagine lots of different things acquiring this sudden release of applicable step forward, right? We've suddenly had we've had helicopters, and there's a siren. We've had like a lot of these things for a long time, and then suddenly there's this big step, which was these kind of autonomous, self-writing, navigable things, which was just a combination of different things coming together to make this quadcopter. And you could see that just kind of being applied to different areas. So how can we then do, self-driving cars is a bit like that, but hasn't come into fruition like in the short amount of time people thought it would. But what other things can we just apply this sort of technology to? These algorithms, a lot of statistics, a lot of crunching of data really, really quickly. And I feel like we haven't had that. I think, I guess, is what you were alluding to. Is I think we could probably still do a lot of that with infrastructure, and maybe it's less obvious to see, the fruits of those sorts of applications. But things where there's just a lot of data happening all the time, and there's probably easy wins and coming together of different technologies. Those are the places which you kind of want to see real activity and real kind of steps forward. And I don't think we've seen as much, or maybe not so obviously, as we have with self-driving cars, quadcopters. Trying to think of some other examples. I'm going to Segway again. That's sort of the similar era,
Yeah. Well, and it's not quite as sexy. If you look at it, it's like saying self-driving cars is always going to get the headline attention, as opposed to like the other applications that the quadcopter could be used for. But yeah, I like that answer. So let's talk about your podcast. And you've been doing it for a while now. It's 4 years or over 4 years, maybe.
Since 2016, so early 2016. So
almost, 5 years now.
5 years, yeah.
And what I like about that is the world was a completely different place in 2016, especially with respect to AI and the uses, the companies that had adopted AI, like even the idea of ethics around AI. Can you talk to me about some of the changes that you've seen as you've gone through these 5 years?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you point that out, because, standing in hindsight now, it seems like it's everywhere. And it might be just my bubbles, my kind of Twitter sphere and things, everyone's talking about it. And back in 2015, when I was starting to talk like in public about this sort of topic, and really having no idea what I was talking about, right? Just having an inkling that I was excited about this area. I wanted to talk about it. And in talking about it, it almost kind of meant that I could have those conversations, and that was sort of the driving force behind doing those talks, and then subsequently thinking maybe I should invite people on to do a podcast and we can talk about it in like more length and then share it, and hopefully that would be useful to someone. And it was really like that, because there wasn't obviously a outlet. And in fact, one of the people, this is a bit shaming, but one of the people who you've had on your podcast, which I've also had on my podcast, very early on in the episode, so you could find out who it is if you went and checked. But they said to me, maybe you should change the name of the podcast, because the machine thing I can kind of understand, but ethics, isn't that going to be too limiting and too specific, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a year after that, they came to me, and we were at a conference in London, a CogX conference, I think. And they were like, okay, well, I was wrong.
Ethics is actually big.
There's mileage in this, and from then it's only got bigger. Like it's got ridiculous now. Back then, actually, it wasn't super clear that it was. I think that was a year after, so 2017, maybe, and there was a lot to do with kind of the construction of AI. Like, who are the people making AI, and the getting more diversity in that process. There's a lot on diversity. There's a lot on, or that I could see anyway, being talked about, and there was a bit about bias, and that was really it. There wasn't, the questions hadn't really been asked properly yet or extrapolated out. And obviously, there's a lot more happening in the world of just AI generally that played out in that time. Lots more kind of applications and big capital buyouts and all these sorts of things happening in the business world. Scandals. Yeah, exactly. Big scandals. Manipulation.
Documentaries.
And just talking about it. So from 2015, it was this explosion of like IoT, and the big data was a couple of years before. People were talking about these kind of names, big data analytics. IoT was still really early, kind of in 2015, although it's been around for a couple of years. And for me, it was really those things coming together and going, yeah, but like, how does this change us? Like, what effect do these things have? And that's why I started to think about this more concretely, and go and like look at the people already doing it. Right, that's what that was the podcast. Like, let's go and talk to the people who are literally already doing this. Lots of academics, and now it's all over the business world as well. So there's lots of designers and business people who may have been talking about it before, but just not called AI ethics. It was called something else. So, I mean, it's just this kind of melting pot now, and it's taken on this shape. And it's just much more pervasive than it ever was back then. And it's really awesome that it's happened. But I also have different feelings about it as well. So we can maybe talk about that.
Yeah, let's get into that too.
I guess, so for me, there's this focus in, I guess, what is now called AI ethics, right? Which is this umbrella term for like maybe talking about lots of different things about ethics and technology, mostly to do with AI applications. I'm doing this funny thing with my hands that no one can see at home if they're listening without the video. I like to gesticulate, sorry. And there's lots of things in there which are not necessarily always included in this word AI ethics. So I'm really excited about all those things, like transhumanism. That's not really talked about in AI ethics. There is this kind of big gap on what is it we should be doing, which is more an ethical, like a meta-ethical question about what society should be kind of striving for. That's kind of not really in there. And then there's all this stuff around, personhood and what some people would say roboethics, and not roboethics, possibly roboethics, but also kind of the ethics of having a entity, like a robotic entity, but just a artificial entity having rights and all that sort of stuff in that conversation. And then there's this, obviously, the idea of the singularity and having something which is either much more intelligent than us, or the coming together of us and intelligence, this artificial intelligence. And those things are really interesting for different reasons. But I guess the AI ethics thing is more of a business case, from what I understand when I'm talking to people, is how, and it's about application to what's going on right now, which is fine. And, what is machine learning applications mostly? They don't really talk about generative stuff or evolutionary algorithms don't really talk about kind of old stuff like expert systems necessarily, or that doesn't really. So it's I don't know. So that's my personal viewpoint. But that's only picked up when I'm talking to people. When you talk about AI, they normally mean machine learning techniques.
Yeah.
And there's all this kind of like the meaning is this thing, right? When actually there's a whole world of AI stuff out there, and it would be nice to explore that sometime as well. But
So what is it? You mentioned transhumanism. Can you break that down for us? What is that, first of all, and then why is it that you're super excited about it?
Well, I guess the caveat there is I don't know much about it, and I'm not super excited about it. So,
Okay.
transhumanism is not a recent thing, and it's, as far as I can understand, and there are lots of very clever people who are talking about it, or who just have an interest in how humans go into this kind of technology mediated future where the technology is mediating us essentially. So we are coming closer to the things that we make. And I think, like the singularity, there's kind of several interpretations of how that will play out. But it's kind of coming into politics in a way, because it's this idea of what should we put down as legislation for the future, because we want to encourage this way of being, so we need to do X, Y, and Z to encourage that. So it is quite political in nature, as far as I can see, and it actually does come down to what's the idea of where we're heading, right? Which is this kind of like ethical trajectory. What's it going to look like in 50 years' time, for example? So it is interesting in that sense, but I'm not very close to it.
So when you were first starting, I just think, because I still feel like the AI ethics space is very new and it hasn't hit yet. First of all, I feel like the whole machine learning space is very new. And then we're a niche within the niche. When you were first starting in 2016, how hard was it to find people that were doing stuff in this area?
I thought you might ask this one. It was relatively difficult because you were basically talking to people who were sort of talking around the subject because they were roboticists or AI people, or they wrote a book about it. So so we had some authors and we had some designers and makers of things. The first person we interviewed was actually doing self-driving car testing. So that does tell you a little bit, about what kinds of things were happening at the time. It's not that long ago, but it wasn't obvious. It wasn't like people had things in their Twitter profile or whatever. It wasn't super obvious that they would be interested in talking about this subject on the podcast. There were certain people who were like obvious choices. So they would get wheeled literally. I do this like impression, like literally wheeled out on the news whenever there was this type of subject. And they were Joe Bryson and Alan. Alan, what's the second name? Oh, I'm terrible. Alan Winfield and a few others. And these people they've just been doing this for a long time, right? They've been investigating in this area and doing, practical and ethical, philosophical stuff in academia, and it was awesome to speak to them on the podcast, and I'm really grateful, and I'm constantly grateful. You have some great people on your podcast, and it's amazing to speak to them and have some real sparks of insight from those people who spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff.
That's it.
So it is great, but yeah, it's become easier in that time for sure.
Did you see it as like there was a point, like an inflection point, or was it just a gradual over time you started to see more and more talk about it?
I think it was 2018, and it was just this deluge of principles. So every company under the sun or organization, governments, they started creating kind of principles for AI, or their AI principles, or their aligned AI, these documents which basically outline something that they wanted to publicly say that they either cared about, or some processes they had for their production of AI. And so I think in 2018 that really kind of exploded, and everyone was doing it. And it became almost, in my world, a meme of itself, because it was kind of like, of course they've got an AI principles document, of course. Is that going to be useful? Who knows? We haven't seen the fruit of this yet. But it was becoming ridiculous by 2019. And early in late 2017, I was kind of like, oh, maybe I should write some principles for AI ethics. And I didn't, and I'm sort of glad. Because they wouldn't have been half as good as, obviously all these combinations of principles coming together. But also, it hasn't been necessarily apparent that these principles have turned into something which is necessarily directly applicable. So there is that too. And it's hard to see the difference in some organizations. But yeah.
Speaking about that, like going from principles or words that are written on a piece of paper or a screen and then turning them into action, that's one thing that sometimes I'm a little bit like, I get down because all I'm doing is talking with people about change that potentially needs to happen or ways that we need to look at things. But again, we're a very niche within a niche. And I wonder, it's like how much impact that is going to have and how can we put actionable steps on that. So are there any areas that you've seen actually create impact?
Yeah, I think it's easier to look at the places where it hasn't, and there have been difficulties because they're just more black and white. This thing is bad. Whereas things which aren't necessarily blowing up in someone's face are a little bit harder to say, is that thing good, or it just hasn't blown up yet. So it's difficult to say, but I have heard some good stuff coming from various organizations. Microsoft, IBM, these sorts of places, they are saying very good stuff, and they have people who are good, and I've spoken to them, and they say very encouraging things and do great work. So I can only hope that some of that stuff really does not only transition to kind of projects and, but gets embedded in a culture, right? Because I think that's one of the things which has to occur, because for me, this idea of ethics, or kind of like embedding ethics, isn't anyone's job, right? It's almost like people have to be upskilled, or just kind of there has to be this baseline thing happen, so that we're kind of all aligned. We're kind of, in school, we never really, unless you did kind of philosophy or something like that, we never really had applications of kind of right and wrong conduct necessarily. And this kind of, I don't know, it's, if you did debating and maybe religious studies, a little bit in philosophy, maybe that's a through line, but you can just avoid those things completely. So I think there should be, like doing your taxes, like certain things that should be included in education, so that when we get to this adulthood stage and we are building stuff which literally affects everyone's lives, because they have this stupid thing called a phone in their pocket that mediates their existence, that they understand, that they are affecting people in a very direct way. And if they're not, probably in an indirect way. And when you're talking about AI specifically, you can set something up to affect lots of people indirectly, autonomously, using fancy statistics, right? Kind of this, I'm going to use this derogatory term for machine learning, sorry. But I do love machine learning. But using machine learning and kind of like having all these other things wrapped up in that, like deferring responsibility and obviously all the fairness and bias stuff, where you're getting your data from, provenance, and just using the right algorithms and just doing a good job, like caught up in that scenario. And those things really affect lots of people, especially if you're working at scale, like the Googles of the world. But even if you're not, you might be a startup that are creating this product, and it could be like an assistant or something very, very useful that turns into something that everyone has in their hands. TikTok, I don't know, like all these things, they blow up overnight, and then suddenly there is this kind of power exchange, and we just have to be mindful of how we create these things, right? And I don't think it's all on us. I think the systems are actually stacked up against us, but we could do a better job there. And I think part of what this community is advocating is education, and that is designers and business people and developers and all sorts of different people, and then they can work together and they can make really great products for society, instead of for capital or whatever else it is. So again, that's a bit of a rant, but like it's you can tell I'm getting fired up here, but there's a lot in there, but it's just really important that we kind of it's not a band-aid, right? It's this thing that we are imbuing to our community, to the employees that we have, to enable them to do a better job, hopefully, as well. So, yeah.
I like this point of bringing the baseline education up and making sure that it's not just the responsibility of the ethicist to think about these things. It should be everyone's responsibility, and we should have this code in our minds as we're developing products, especially data products or fancy statistics or AI when it gets to the next levels, and how it's going to affect people, what kind of repercussions there could be, and trying to play out every scenario. I think that is something that is very important, and it can't be like we can't pass the buck to someone else for doing that. And that's a great point. Along these lines of like conversations or themes that you feel like you've seen cropping up again and again over the last 5 years, what have been some like main topics that just keep coming up and you notice them, you feel like they're not finishing, or you want to bring more attention to them?
Yeah. So I guess I'll pay attention to some of the well-known ones and then some of the less well-known ones. And sorry if you disagree with me on these, people out there. You lovely people with your opinions. You're allowed to disagree with me, and you can shout at me on Twitter afterwards. It's fine. So I mean, diversity is a very important one, and I wholeheartedly believe that is worth chasing. Right? That's not ethics washing, or just liberalism, or the liberal elite telling us that we should do something a certain way. That is just how things should work better, right? So more diversity is only going to be a good thing in my mind. Bias and fairness, those things are difficult, and working with sort of technology which ingests quite a lot of information that we create, that's a difficult scenario. So we should be very delicate about those things, and we should reflect on them and understand them and not blindly do stuff. But it doesn't mean that we'll have the right answers all the time, So that's something that which we kind of have to collaborate on and make good for ourselves in the business community, in the research community, and have some sort of agreement on the best way of doing stuff. Working with this type of data, you should look out for this sort of thing, and that should be a well-known fact about different kinds of data coming from different places, and that should be easy in that way. There are ways of working these things out. And there are indeed ways, like tools at our disposal to help as well. So those are like two big things, and I think they just keep coming round and around, and that is fine. Before all this kind of blew up, I think there was this idea of the singularity, which was kind of like the polarizing idea. And obviously there was a couple of advocates, well-known advocates for this, and books like Superintelligence and things like this, where we extrapolate into the future and we say, with the tools that we have right now and accelerating compute power or ideas and algorithms we're making, we're going to produce this in the next 10, 20, 50 years. And we should start thinking about things associated with that, which is kind of more fringe, like the alignment problem. So how do we if these are things going to be created at all, and when I mean that, I mean kind of a generalized artificial intelligence, like super intelligence. If we're going to make this a tool and it looks like people are interested in making it, right? Then we should probably work out how it's going to work in a positive fashion, right? And one of the biggest things that people have looked at is this idea of this misalignment. So we create something and then it either annihilates us because it interprets us wrong, because there's a lot of semantic knowledge wrapped up in the things that we say and the things that we don't say. And it's very hard to actually, if anyone's done NLP, like natural language processing for sentiment, then they all know that there's a lot of things that are hard to work out from people, and people actually are not very good at necessarily communicating their values or their needs very effectively. And that is a problem when you're talking about machines which have less nuance about them. And they're also playing a different game, right? Because they're not playing in this social game that we are all existing in. The social game, which is we have to cooperate because we have to feed ourselves, and we have this economic and legal infrastructure. And they don't live in that world. So the world that they live in is going to look really different as well, again. So these environments interacting spell all sorts of strange happenings, which we need to anticipate, which is partly to do with this alignment problem. And there's been lots of people like talking about how we rectify that, but there's no real consensus at the moment how that plays out. So that's a real fertile area, but it has no definitive business application right now, which is one of the issues. Another area which is my personal fascination, not just me, but like out of all these different things, I'm most fascinated by machine ethics. And after the title was given to my podcast, I realized that there was actually a thing already called machine ethics. So that was kind of pie in my face, but it kind of worked out because it is awesome. So machine ethics is the idea that if you have an artificial agent, so it could be anything, it could be the dumbest thing ever, but it has some sort of kind of moral responsibility to something else. So though it can't necessarily be a moral patient, so, if you turn it off, you're not going to worry about it being, you killed it or something. It's able to affect people who have patiency. So it might affect me, for example. So, and a good example of this is there's an automated car, and it makes decisions on someone's behalf. And though the car, if it crashed, you wouldn't worry about it. But if there was someone in the car, then obviously you would. So that's the kind of definition or the difference, let's say. So machine ethics is this kind of pursuit of what does that mean to have a moral agent operating in an environment, and how do we make something which is actually kind of more aligned, this is an alignment thing coming in again, with what we want, or what are the norms that we see in the world. And that's just super interesting. And I don't think that's really got a definitive kind of set of solutions yet either. Thanks. Ramble over.
Well, going back to the diversity and bias piece, I think that part is so important, as you mentioned. And I'm wondering why you feel like it's still being talked about. Does that mean that like there's not really advancements happening in it?
Yeah, I think the diversity thing is yeah, it's a problem, right? It's constantly a problem, and it's not just technology, but it's been traditionally a problem in tech companies, and it needs to get better. But it also comes down to previous mistakes. So if you want encouraging more developers who are female, for example, then we've got this big. There might be a big gap when there weren't so many people in education, encouraging girls to do computing, whatever. If they were like looking like they're interested, or just that wasn't the culture they were brought up in, for various reasons, right? And we need to do better at kind of encouraging people generally um, to be brought up into different positions. And technology is great because it has so much buying power at the moment. So the idea that you can have a steady job in tech is very much a thing. So you want to encourage people to have flexible hours and to have nice perks and stuff like that, then technology is a good place to be. And it's just really interesting as well, in my personal opinion. So even if you're doing, design or more developer stuff, or leading a team or doing agile development processes, then there's lots of places for people with different skill sets, and we should really be encouraging a broad spectrum of people to do those jobs, right? Where we can, because we want to bring people up, and we want people generally to be to feel like they are enabled and to have mobility, right? But also the products that you create with a diverse team are coming from a diverse place. So the hope is there that you are able to create things which, have don't have stupid things happening because we didn't test it on certain people, because hopefully that would have been picked up in the development process and all this sort of stuff. You get like a better mixing pot of ideas and all this sort of thing. So although you might be a small team, you want to talk to lots of people. There's things you can do regardless of like how you work, right? Big companies, obviously, it's a different ball game, but I think I always feel like it's different for small companies, and I think small companies they can still do things in this area which can be helpful for themselves, as well as helping people get into the jobs they want to get. So
Yeah, I find it fascinating because I know various companies that are small companies and they tried to hire as diversely as possible and struggle because the field that you can choose from is so limited, because we don't have what you were talking about. We don't have so many, like, it's much easier to find a white male who can do the job because there are so many more of them. And then I've even heard complaints from different CEOs saying, "Yeah, we've been trying really hard and we've interviewed, but the women that we've interviewed they know that they're oversubscribed. They know that their position is very, very high up because they are a woman in tech. So there have been some things where we look at it and we say, do we take a hit on the cultural side because they're not the perfect cultural fit, but we get diversity? Or do we continue with the trends that we've been doing?" And this probably sounds horrible coming from two white men talking about this right now. And I understand that we have like no reason to, like, we should just probably
No.
talk about it. But
I think you're thinking about it wrong. I think we are part of the problem and therefore part of the solution, right? So I think we've got a lot to do and a lot to say. I just don't think we are necessarily the best advocates for this, right?
Yeah.
So I think we can do so much, and it is difficult sometimes. But I think it's not as difficult as people maybe make out it is. But again, I've not been in those positions of those hiring positions. So it's really easy for me to say on this side of the mic, right? So, but yeah, I think the issue that you were talking about before is their argument was a cultural argument, and I think there are things you can do there as well. So I don't know. It is difficult, but I think if you're running a business, you're also running, you're not running a club or like a fun time show, right? You're running a business and you want people to work well together, and you need to facilitate that. And part of that is like building a culture, but also encouraging that culture to develop. So I don't know. I think these things can be worked out, but if the person is not a very nice person, then maybe don't hire them. But like, I don't think. I don't know. There's pithy things I want to say, but I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
I think I know where you're going with that, and I can see the point completely. And the other piece I wanted to say around this just flew away from my mind when we were thinking about that. But it is a fascinating conversation, because if we look at today, the amount of people that are able to, or are capable of, let's just say, doing front end development, right? And you have this difference. You have whatever it is, that there's more white men that you can choose from. Then to get women involved in this, or to get someone else from a different race, it doesn't, we've kind of been saying it's women or men, but of course there's other areas that you can choose from to have diverse teams. I guess the question that I have is, how can we get people involved that aren't necessarily coders or designers? Do you feel like there's a potential to bring people in that don't have these specialties in coding, but could still have specialties in just, it's like, I think of it like they have the background, they have the culture specialties, they have the insights, and maybe it's not that you hire them as a full-time employee, but like you were saying, you need to go out there and you need to talk with these people before you put any product into the market, especially if it is a data product that is using data from many different sources.
Yeah. So this is a general practice, right? So this is already happening, and if it's not happening, then you're doing something wrong. If you're making something for people, then the accepted idea behind this when you're designing is you go talk to those people. And it just so happens that if you're designing for everyone, which is kind of a hard thing to do, but obviously we have lots of things which are aimed at lots and lots of people, millions of people, then you have to go and talk to a cross-section of those people, and you have to work out, you don't have to, but it is advised to go and talk to those people about how those things, how you can better improve your product, how their usage of the product is happening, and learn from those people, and play anthropologist and do your user research. So I don't think this is something new or obscure for teams already doing this work. But I guess it's like working out what is the ethical saliency in some of that work, and pulling that out is some of the work that I'm doing at the moment. So, what advice would you give to user researchers and designers when they are thinking about their specific users, and they will have specific users? Is it that they are actually incorporating thinking around the users and their, direct network, for example, and the kind of people that might be influenced by their usage of whatever the system that you're using is, kind of those indirect unintended consequences of the system itself? And are you being, is it appropriate, the things you're doing for those users? And indeed, on a higher level, is it appropriate, at all to do it? What's the kind of environment that this product is going to create in the future? So there's kind of lots of levels of thinking there, but I think that you should, the teams should be doing this thinking already in a way. So, yeah.
So who do you feel like is being, I don't want to say pushed into AI, or different profiles that you're seeing coming up in the AI space?
How do you mean, companies or?
Yeah, so I would say like along these lines of new hires and new titles that are being created, because I think I see every day on LinkedIn somebody with a new title around AI. And part of that is just because we can make up our own titles on LinkedIn. And the other part is because there might actually be a need or a genuine problem that they're solving, and it is actually a valid title. What do you feel like are new roles within AI that have come about?
I don't know, but I think it's funny because I think it was data scientist as a thing has only been around for so long, right? I think it's just over 10 years that data scientist was a coined thing. And it was around about the same time that we had Code Ninja and social media guru and all sorts of ridiculousness happening in people's business cards. Yeah, exactly. So I imagine it was probably quite hard to take seriously. And interestingly, in 2015, right, I was joking with someone that, I should put AI ethicist on my business card, right? Oh yeah, I could be an AI ethicist. And people are that now, right? People do, that's what they sell themselves as. And I kind of have that on my thing because everyone else does, not because I think it's actually necessarily appropriate. It just makes it easier for people to hire me or contact me.
The irony.
Yeah, the irony. So these things change over time, and there's lots of different kind of jobs, like a data engineer and data scientist, and even strange things like digital anthropologists are coming into the business world now. I think the underrated people in this way are sociologists, like people who really understand people's data are gold dust. I really don't find enough of those people, because you have all this data coming in, and if it's not like geological data, right? If you're talking about satellite data, geological data, weather data, something like that, you're talking about kind of something which is in line with someone who knows about those sorts of things. A lot of the apps and things like that are to do with usage, people usage, and people preference and people stuff. And those people are sociologists and anthropologists, right, who study that stuff. And designers and user experienced people and user researchers, they do some of that work for sure. But they don't necessarily understand data. And sociologists, in my mind, are the perfect in-between, where they understand some of the kind of the aspects of collecting and asking questions of people and translating that into something useful over here. And then you can work with those people to then build that up into systems and work out how you can exploit those into strange algorithmic decision-making circumstances. But yeah, I haven't met enough people who say they are a sociologist.
Wow.
And you just think about the amount of forms that you fill in on a daily basis, the things that you click on, and the meanings of those interactions get incorporated into these designs from designers and developers, not from anyone else necessarily who actually knows about how people interact. So I find like this, it's baffling to me sometimes. And again, I do think designers are doing a lot of this work at the moment, but I think there could be a bigger place for people who have a closer affinity to people interacting with data, who are, in my mind, are those sociologists. But yeah, I could be jumping up the wrong tree, but I think there's a gap there.
Yeah, where did all the sociologists go? That is an interesting one. Or maybe it's just that they don't know there is a market here, or that their skills can be used for what is happening in this sector.
Yeah.
I like that. I hadn't thought about that, but it makes complete sense. I'll buy into your theory. I definitely can see it. Yes.
You could call it something else. You could call it like data psychologist or something. You could give it a new title. It doesn't matter. But it's that person whose, I guess, its job is to take incoming data and maybe tweak it. Tell the designer, actually, if you say this instead of this, you might get a different response. And that response is actually going to be more applicable to what we're trying to infer from them. And these sorts of micro interactions are where we often trip up in this process.
Yeah, that's huge, right? And it's on so many levels, like the copy, how this looks, where do you put the buttons, and all of the little nuances that you're speaking of, this micro pieces that play a part in the macro.
Yeah, definitely.
So because I am sure that you have seen the leaked proposed regulation that came out just last week, and for those who are listening, we're probably going to put this episode out in a few months, so it may be totally water under the bridge, or no, that's not the right metaphor for it, but it might be old news by the time this comes out. But I would like to talk about a bigger question, which is the differences between ethics in the US and in Europe, and how you've seen those play out in the people that you've interviewed.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that, because the last interviewee that I had, which probably will be a couple of episodes back now, which is Josie Young, actually did talk about this dichotomy, because she used to live in London, now lives in Vancouver, I think. Yeah, that's right. And the difference that she sees, because I haven't spent a long time, I've holidayed in the US, but I've never spent months at a time, is that you have this, in Europe, you have this kind of pro top-down legislative power thing going on. So people are interested in legislation and are happy that, or they can debate whether the legislation is good or bad, such, but they are happy to do that kind of in private. Whereas she thinks that because there's kind of more of a state-led situation, so it's more kind of, it seems more local, that you will get out onto the streets more readily and go and advocate your point of view on a subject. There's this new piece of legislation kind of thought about, and let's go and riot about it, right? Let's go and have our say, like today. And we do have some of that, but I don't, like Josie just sees that we are less prone to go out on the streets. Maybe the French a bit more so, for sure.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I think the difference isn't probably as stark as it should be. I think the UK government are very, now that we're been Brexited from the European Union, the things that they say about AI is generally very pro-business. So I think they've got, in my humble opinion, not spent a lot of time in the cabinet at all. But the things they say that I've seen is pro-business. We want to encourage innovation, and we want to encourage AI stuff to happen. And we are not anti-legislation, but we are very cautious. And I think there's a similar tactic to what the US is saying as well. where they are pro business, they're pro capital. So it's a bit of a difficult one for those legislators.
And how do you feel about that stance?
I think, well, I've got lots of feelings about this. So I think I've been trying to work out recently if what we are talking about, and if you stay in this AI ethics bubble and you actually don't, I mean, this idea of like whether this is useful at all as a stance is probably in there. But if you don't spend a lot of time with that question, you're then going to just do the work and it's going to be fine. But it's all in service of this, shareholder thing that has grown up out of capitalist economics. And I'm trying to work out whether that is incompatible with what we are trying to do with ethics or AI ethics. And I'm trying to, and there's a lot of talk about environmentalism and incorporating social responsibility in a more meaningful way in business. And there's lots of push to do that, and lots of acronyms of people's jobs in big companies that do those sorts of things. That's great. But I think there's still this piece missing where structurally, right, the infrastructure of how business operates isn't set up for pro-social, pro-environmental activity. Unless you're doing very specific things like charities or social enterprises or whatever. But the majority of money-making activity isn't that. And I think that's probably a problem. And I haven't spent a lot of time researching it to work out how it can be resolved or how there could be other options. And it aggravates me when there's lots of people who are researching this and just find it interesting and like I was speaking to someone the other day, and it was like, great, there's all this strange things happening around assetization of digital products and resources and stuff like that, and trading. And I'm like, cool, but what is that good? Is that bad? Like, what's your take? And I wish people like that had more of a thrust into, well, actually, it could be better like this, or actually, this is probably a negative thing going forward. And it's hard to say, probably, but I think you have to use your imagination sometimes and work out and be brave, right? And have a stance on things. And I think my stance is going to be that it's that we probably have to transition into a world which doesn't favor capital anymore as the number one driver. And that is an economic system which is going to have to wholesale change. And I don't know necessarily how that change will occur. But if it doesn't happen, I'm not sure I can do my job very well, right? And it's been really interesting working with public organizations recently, because that is less of a problem. So I'm actually having to think in a whole different way, because I haven't got this capital thing weighing me down constantly, like shareholders and business strategy and executives and stuff like this. And I haven't realized how much of a weight off my shoulders it has been not to have to deal with that in that direct way anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's like these two counter-opposing forces.
Yeah.
And they're really battling against each other for who wins out.
They're not always battling either. It's just that infrastructurally they are. Like, some businesses are driven by really amazing leaders who lead great companies, right? And have a passion, and they have maybe a set of values which is aligned with some of that stuff. But just the infrastructure of how companies are created and bought and sold, and capital is exchanged and markets are made, that's not where you have to have those people involved to actually make that happen. Wherever infrastructurally we should do something there.
Big words from you, Ben. I like it. Calling for change. Calling for a revolution, I might even say. So I've got one last question for you before we go. And I really want to thank you for coming on here and talking to me about all this good stuff and sharing this evolution that you've seen. It's really fascinating for me, who I'm a bit newer in the field, and I get to talk to you, an old hat, we could say, in the field, and you chased after it just because you were interested in it. And I love hearing that. You wanted to have conversations. There was something that you said at the beginning, is that if I started a podcast, I could have conversations with these people. And it's exactly that. Like, I can relate with that so much because I wanted to have these conversations. And I felt like these conversations needed to be had also. And so, yeah, what can we do? Well, we're all locked at home, or at least we were. Now, some people aren't as locked at home as I am in Germany. I'm still stuck at home. So
I'm in the office, but there's no one
here.
here. So
yeah. So the last question that I have for you, Ben, is: are you a robot?
Yes. There's no good answer there.
Yeah, it's really hard to explain why you're not.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you could. I mean, I guess it depends on your definition of robot, right? But I'm going to go with yes, I'm a robot.
Final answer. All right, I like it, and I appreciate you being on here again. This has been awesome. Great chatting.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for your time.